When people imagine France, they often think of it as a cohesive and distinct culture, with its characteristic language, cuisine, and traditions. However, recent advances in genetic research paint a very different picture. France's population is not homogenous, nor has it ever been. Instead, the French genetic identity is the product of thousands of years of human migration, conquest, trade, and settlement. Every region of France tells a different story, holding on to distinct genetic patterns that reflect ancient movements of people across the continent. Situated at the heart of Europe, France has long served as a crossroads for various migrating populations. Waves of people came from Central Europe, the Mediterranean, and beyond, bringing new cultural and genetic influences. These waves were not always peaceful. Some groups arrived through conquest, while others came seeking better opportunities or fleeing environmental hardships. But over time, each migration left a genetic footprint, enriching the diversity we see in modern France. Some regions, like Brittany, carry strong ties to the Celtic world, while others, like Corsica, maintain deep historical connections to Italy. Similarly, the people of Gascony in the southwest share unique genetic markers with the Basques of northern Spain, making them distinct from other French populations. What makes France so fascinating is that these genetic differences are not just academic. They reflect real cultural distinctions that persist today. The language, food, and traditions in different parts of the country often mirror the ancient populations that shaped them. For example, olive oil and Mediterranean diets dominate southern France, while dairy-based dishes are more common in the north. Regional dialects, from Breton in the northwest to Occitan in the south, also reflect this complex ancestry. Modern genetic studies provide invaluable insights into these historical movements, showing that France is a mosaic of interconnected but distinct identities. By sequencing the DNA of present-day and ancient populations, scientists have been able to map how these migrations took place and how they continue to shape France today. This story isn't just about the distant past. It's also about how modern France sees itself, a country that embraces both national unity and regional diversity. Understanding the genetic origins of the French people allows us to appreciate the layers of history embedded in every part of the nation, offering a glimpse into the complex processes that have shaped one of the world's most iconic cultures. The earliest chapters of France's genetic history begin with the Western hunter-gatherers, who roamed across Europe more than 30,000 years ago. These nomadic groups lived through harsh ice age climates, moving across regions in search of food and shelter. Some of these hunter-gatherers eventually settled in what is now France, leaving genetic traces that can still be detected today, particularly in isolated communities like the Pyrenees. These prehistoric people formed the first genetic foundation of France, long before farming or permanent settlements appeared. A major transformation occurred with the arrival of Neolithic farmers from the Middle East. These early agriculturalists introduced farming techniques and new ways of life, including animal domestication and crop cultivation. As they spread across Europe, they intermarried with the hunter-gatherers already living in France, creating a blended population. Genetic evidence suggests that this mixing was not uniform. While some areas experienced high levels of intermarriage, others, such as mountainous or coastal regions, remained more isolated. This isolation preserved the distinct DNA of the original inhabitants, which can still be found in parts of France today. The landscape itself played a critical role in shaping these genetic patterns. Natural barriers like the Alps and Pyrenees limited the movement of people, keeping certain groups relatively untouched by later migrations. For example, modern genetic studies show that people living in the Pyrenees carry a higher percentage of hunter-gatherer DNA than those in other parts of France. This suggests that these ancient populations managed to survive and thrive in remote areas, while larger groups migrated across the open plains of Europe. One of the fascinating discoveries from genetic research is that France's prehistoric populations also had connections with other parts of Europe. Some DNA markers found in France today can be traced back to Iberian and Italian groups, indicating that prehistoric communities traded and intermarried even across considerable distances. These early networks of interaction laid the foundation for later migrations, making France a crucial hub in the movement of people across the continent. Today, the genetic legacy of these ancient settlers lives on, not only in the DNA of the French people, but also in the regional cultures and traditions they developed. Some isolated rural communities, particularly in the Pyrenees and the Alps, still reflect the old ways of life. Hints of an ancient world that managed to survive in the shadows of more dominant historical events. These prehistoric migrations remind us that France's identity has always been shaped by movement, adaptation, and diversity. Long before the rise of the Roman Empire, the territory now known as France was home to a patchwork of Celtic tribes, collectively referred to as the Gauls. These people were part of a larger Celtic culture that spread across much of Western Europe, bringing with them unique languages, religious practices, and artistic traditions. The Celts arrived in waves, likely starting around 500 BCE, and their influence became deeply rooted in the landscape of France. The most distinctive Celtic legacy remains in the northwestern region of Brittany, where genetic and cultural links to Wales and Cornwall are still evident today. The Gauls were known for their fierce independence, often resisting attempts by foreign powers to dominate them. Despite sharing a common cultural foundation, the Celtic tribes of Gaul were not politically unified, making it difficult for them to resist the Roman conquest in 52 BCE. However, even after their defeat, the Gauls left a lasting mark on the region's genetic and cultural identity. Brittany stands out as the region where Celtic traditions have endured the most, both in terms of language and genetics. To this day, the Breton language, a close relative of Welsh, is spoken in some parts of Brittany, and the people of this region show closer genetic ties to the British Isles than to other parts of France. In southwestern France, another fascinating Celtic connection can be found. The people of Gascony share unique genetic markers with the Basques, an ancient population from northern Spain. The Basques are thought to be one of the oldest continuous ethnic groups in Europe, with a genetic profile that predates the arrival of Indo-European languages. This suggests that the Gascon people may have roots that extend back even further than the Celts, connecting them to Europe's prehistoric past. These regional differences illustrate the complexity of France's genetic landscape. While the Celtic identity has faded in many parts of the country, it remains remarkably intact in places like Brittany and Gascony. The persistence of these ancient identities highlights how geography, culture, and genetics intertwine to shape the people of a nation. Even as France became politically unified over the centuries, the genetic and cultural legacies of its early inhabitants have continued to influence the way people live, speak, and identify today. The Roman conquest of Gaul, which began in 58 BCE and concluded in 52 BCE with Julius Caesar's victory, brought profound changes to the genetic and cultural landscape of France. The arrival of Roman settlers, merchants, and soldiers didn't just mark a political transformation. It also introduced a new wave of genetic influences from across the Roman Empire. The integration of Gaul into Roman civilization opened the door for populations from Italy, Greece, North Africa, and the Middle East to settle in the region, especially in the south of France. This influx of people left a noticeable genetic imprint, which can still be detected in modern DNA studies, particularly in regions like Marseille and the Provence-Alpes-Côte d'Azur. One of the most important aspects of Roman influence was the establishment of urban centers and trade routes. Cities like Lyon, once Lugdunum, and Marseille, Massalia, became melting pots, attracting people from different parts of the empire. Marseille, in particular, had a long history of multiculturalism, as it was originally a Greek colony before becoming part of the Roman sphere. As the Roman Empire expanded, trade routes brought people from distant provinces such as Egypt and Carthage, enriching the genetic pool of southern France. The genetic legacy of Roman rule is most evident in the Mediterranean markers found in the DNA of modern French people, particularly in the southern regions. Studies suggest that populations in Provence, the French Riviera, and parts of the Rhone Valley exhibit genetic similarities to Italian and Iberian groups, reflecting the movement of people within the Roman Empire. These regions also show higher frequencies of certain Y chromosome markers associated with populations in the Italian peninsula, confirming the lasting impact of Roman migration. However, the Roman genetic influence was not evenly distributed. While southern France became deeply integrated into the Roman world, northern and western regions retained much of their Celtic and later Germanic heritage. Even after Gaul's official incorporation into the empire, rural areas in the north remained less affected by Romanization. This divide between northern and southern France, both culturally and genetically, persists to some extent today. Southern France's cuisine, architecture, and traditions continue to reflect its Mediterranean roots, whereas northern France developed closer ties to Central and Northern Europe in later centuries. The collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century CE didn't erase these genetic contributions. Instead, the genes introduced during the Roman period became a permanent part of the French population's makeup. The Mediterranean influence, combined with the earlier Celtic and Neolithic layers, created a diverse genetic profile that remains visible in modern DNA analyses. Southern France's distinctiveness, both genetically and culturally, is a testament to the lasting influence of the Roman era, blending ancient Roman, Greek, and even North African elements into the rich tapestry of French identity. After the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century CE, France experienced yet another wave of migration, this time from Germanic tribes. Among the most influential were the Franks, who settled primarily in northern France and gave the country its name. The Franks, along with other groups like the Burgundians and Visigoths, played a key role in reshaping the genetic and cultural landscape of France during the early Middle Ages. Unlike the Roman influence, which was concentrated in the south, these Germanic migrations had a more significant impact in the north and east of the country, regions that remained distinct from southern France both genetically and culturally. The Franks first crossed the Rhine River in the 3rd century, but didn't fully establish their dominance until the collapse of Roman rule. Under the leadership of Clovis I, the Franks unified much of northern France, founding the Merovingian dynasty and laying the foundation for modern France. As they settled in the region, the Franks intermarried with the local population, introducing new Germanic genetic markers. Today, the Y chromosome haplogroups common in northern France show a strong connection to populations in Germany and the Low Countries, reflecting the legacy of Frankish migration. At the same time, the Burgundians settled in the east, establishing the Kingdom of Burgundy, while the Visigoths controlled parts of southern France before being pushed into Spain by the Franks. These migrations introduced diverse Germanic genetic elements, which are still detectable in the DNA of modern French people. Regions like Alsace and Lorraine, close to the German border, exhibit higher levels of Germanic ancestry than the rest of France, a reflection of centuries of migration and cultural exchange between these areas and Central Europe. One of the most striking examples of Germanic influence is found in Normandy, which later became home to Viking settlers. The Vikings, or Norsemen, began raiding the northern coasts of France in the 9th century, eventually settling there and establishing the Duchy of Normandy. Genetic studies reveal that modern Normans carry Scandinavian DNA markers, adding yet another layer of complexity to the genetic story of northern France. This Viking influence is also evident in place names and cultural traditions that persist in Normandy to this day. The Germanic migrations of the early Middle Ages not only reshaped France's genetic makeup, but also contributed to the cultural differences that still exist between the North and South. While the South remained closer to its Roman and Mediterranean roots, the North developed a more Germanic character, with closer ties to the Frankish kingdom and Northern Europe. This North-South divide is still reflected in cultural practices, dialects, and even political attitudes, underscoring how ancient migrations continue to shape France's identity. The early medieval period brought yet another wave of change to France, marked by regional consolidation, new power structures, and fresh migrations. While the Franks had already solidified their control over much of northern France, other parts of the country developed in distinct ways, each influenced by various historical forces, from the Vikings in the northwest to Moorish incursions in the south. These events introduced further genetic diversity and regional identities that are still visible in modern France. One of the most significant migrations during this time was the Viking invasion. Beginning in the late 8th century, Norsemen from Scandinavia raided the coasts of northern France. These incursions intensified over the next century until a crucial turning point in 911 CE, when Rollo, a Viking leader, agreed to settle his people in the region that would become Normandy. In exchange for land, the Vikings converted to Christianity and pledged loyalty to the French crown. This moment was pivotal, not only politically but also genetically. The Vikings intermarried with the local population, adding Scandinavian DNA to the genetic makeup of Normandy. Today, genetic studies reveal that people from Normandy carry traces of Norse ancestry, with DNA markers closely related to populations in Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. This Viking legacy also left a lasting cultural impact, seen in the maritime traditions, architecture, and even place names that remain in the region. Further south, the Pyrenees and southern France experienced influences from the opposite direction. The Moorish invasion from North Africa and Spain in the early 8th century briefly extended into southern France, leaving a subtle genetic imprint. Although the Moorish presence was relatively short-lived compared to other migrations, DNA evidence suggests small but detectable contributions from North African populations in regions like Provence and Languedoc. This adds another layer to the genetic diversity of southern France, complementing the earlier Roman and Celtic influences. During the feudal period, regional identities became even more pronounced. The Duchy of Burgundy, for example, emerged as a powerful political entity with ties to both France and the Holy Roman Empire. This part of France developed strong Germanic connections, reflected in the genetics of people living in modern-day Bourgogne-Franche-Comté and Alsace. The intermingling of Frankish and Burgundian populations during this time created a distinct genetic signature, different from both the Mediterranean South and the Celtic-influenced Northwest. What's remarkable about this period is that regional identities began to solidify not only through genetics, but also through language and culture. Dialects such as Norman, Provençal, and Burgundian flourished, reflecting the diversity of populations that had settled in these areas. Although France would eventually unify under a single crown, these regional distinctions persisted for centuries, influencing everything from local cuisine to architecture. The Viking and medieval migrations are a testament to the fluid nature of France's population history. Far from being a static or isolated nation, France has always been shaped by the movement of people across borders. Whether through Viking raiders, Moorish merchants, or Frankish lords, each wave of migration left behind unique genetic and cultural traces that still influence the way people live and identify today. The coexistence of these identities within a single nation exemplifies the richness of France's history and genetic heritage. The genetic diversity of France continued to evolve in the modern era, driven by waves of immigration from across Europe and beyond. As France industrialized in the 19th and 20th centuries, it became a destination for people seeking new opportunities. Workers from Italy, Spain, Portugal, Poland, and Belgium flocked to France, especially to cities like Paris, Lyon, and Marseille. This influx of people further enriched the nation's genetic pool, adding Southern European and Slavic elements to the existing mosaic. The 20th century also saw significant immigration from France's former colonies in North Africa, West Africa, and the Caribbean. After World War II, France faced a labor shortage, leading to large-scale recruitment of workers from Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, and Senegal. These migrants settled primarily in urban centers, transforming cities like Paris and Marseille into multicultural hubs. Today, the genetic markers of these immigrant communities are an integral part of France's population, reflecting the country's colonial past and its role in global migration networks. The impact of this modern immigration is most evident in France's cultural diversity. Cities like Marseille, with its large North African population, have developed unique cultural identities that blend French traditions with those of the Maghreb. Similarly, the influence of West African and Caribbean communities can be seen in the music, food, and festivals of Paris and Lyon. This blending of cultures has enriched France's identity, creating a dynamic and evolving society that reflects the complexities of the modern world. Genetically, studies have shown that France today is one of the most diverse countries in Europe, with DNA markers from Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe interwoven with older genetic layers from prehistoric settlers, Celts, Romans, and Germanic tribes. This diversity reflects not only recent immigration, but also centuries of historical migrations that have shaped the nation. While debates about immigration and national identity continue to shape political discourse, the reality is that France has always been a land of cultural and genetic diversity. Modern genetics also reveal an important truth. National identity is not defined by a single genetic profile, but by the shared experiences and histories that bind people together. In France, this means embracing a complex heritage that includes everything from hunter-gatherer roots to modern immigration stories. This diversity is not just a product of recent history, but the continuation of a process that has been unfolding for thousands of years. As France moves forward, its ability to embrace both unity and diversity will be crucial. The genetic story of France is a reminder that nations are not static but constantly evolving, shaped by the people who move, settle, and contribute to the communities they become a part of. In many ways, the history of France's genetic origins reflects the broader human story, one of movement, connection, and change. France's geography plays a significant role in its genetic diversity, with a long-standing north-south divide that reflects millennia of migrations, trade routes, and historical events. This divide is not only cultural but also genetic, with distinct regional variations in the DNA of people from northern and southern France. Scholars often compare these two halves of the country. The north aligns more closely with populations in Central and Northern Europe, while the south retains closer genetic ties to the Mediterranean region. The northern regions of France, including Normandy, Picardy, and Alsace, have higher frequencies of Germanic and Scandinavian genetic markers due to historical migrations of Franks, Burgundians, and Vikings. These populations introduced genetic elements similar to those found in Germany, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia. Additionally, the proximity to Belgium and the UK fostered genetic exchange through trade and settlement, leaving a lasting Northern European influence. In contrast, southern France, particularly Provence, Occitanie, and Corsica, carries a stronger Mediterranean genetic signature. This is partly due to Roman colonization and later migration from Italy, Greece, and North Africa. Even today, genetic markers typical of these regions are more common in the south than in the north. In fact, certain areas like Marseille and Corsica have unique DNA clusters that reflect their historical connections to Italy, Greece, and the Levant. Southern France's mild climate and access to Mediterranean trade routes also made it a hub for movement, further enhancing its genetic diversity. The divide between North and South is not only reflected in DNA, but also in culture, language, and traditions. Northern France has historically been more industrial and urban, with closer political ties to neighboring Northern European countries. In contrast, Southern France maintains a more agrarian lifestyle, with a cultural focus on wine, olive oil, and regional dialects like Provençal. These distinctions are the product of the distinct migratory patterns that shaped each part of the country. Interestingly, this north-south divide mirrors broader European genetic patterns. Similar divides exist between northern and southern Italy, Germany, and Spain, demonstrating how geography, climate, and history shape populations. In modern France, though, this genetic divide is becoming less pronounced due to increased mobility, intermarriage, and migration from urban centers. However, it remains a fascinating insight into how ancient and medieval migrations have left their mark on the modern population of France. The genetic contrast between northern and southern France underscores a larger truth. There is no single French identity, but rather a collection of regional identities linked by both shared history and diversity. This diversity reflects France's long history as a crossroads of migration, demonstrating that genetic variety is not a modern phenomenon, but a foundational aspect of the French nation. France's genetic story is a testament to the complexity of human history, demonstrating how centuries of migrations, invasions, and cultural exchanges have shaped the identity of a nation. From the prehistoric hunter-gatherers to the modern waves of immigration, each population that settled in France added a new thread to the fabric of its people. Today, France stands as one of the most genetically diverse countries in Europe, with DNA reflecting influences from Celtic tribes, Romans, Germanic invaders, Viking settlers, and modern immigrants from around the world. What makes France's genetic legacy so remarkable is how regional differences persist. Areas like Brittany, Normandy, Provence, and Corsica retain distinctive genetic and cultural identities, each reflecting the unique migrations that shaped them. Yet despite these differences, the people of France have forged a shared national identity, one that embraces both unity and diversity. This dual identity is seen in the way France preserves its regional languages, cuisines, and customs while maintaining a sense of national cohesion. Modern genetic studies offer new ways to understand France's history, revealing hidden connections between populations and showing how people have moved across borders for millennia. They also challenge the idea of fixed national identities, illustrating that every population is the product of countless migrations and exchanges. This insight is especially important in today's world, where debates about immigration and identity are increasingly prominent. France's genetic story reminds us that movement and diversity have always been part of human history, and that every person, regardless of origin, contributes to the shared story of a nation. Ultimately, the genetic origins of France tell a story of adaptation, resilience, and interconnectedness. Each wave of migration, from the Celts to the Romans to modern immigrants, brought new ideas, cultures, and ways of life. These influences did not erase what came before, but instead blended with existing traditions, creating the rich and varied tapestry that defines France today. This process of blending and adaptation continues in the modern era, as new populations arrive and contribute to the ongoing story of France. In many ways, the genetic history of France reflects the broader human experience. Just as France's identity has been shaped by the people who came before, our own lives are connected to the migrations and histories of our ancestors. Understanding this story allows us to appreciate the beauty of diversity and the ways in which shared history and culture can unite people from different backgrounds. France's genetic origins, far from being a fixed or singular narrative, reveal that diversity is not a challenge to be overcome. It is the very essence of what it means to be human.